I think we're neglecting our young by not educating them about drugs, because they will be exposed to them. And if they're not educated, then they're vulnerable. And I wonder how they handle this in indigenous rainforests. Sure, they don't punish them for using a plant compound. They probably have the shaman there who educates people around which plants are food, which are medicines, which are poisons. I doubt they have a punitive approach. Teachers aren't going to educate kids about that while drugs are illegal, because, well, it would probably cost them their job.
Well, I think part of the education also needs to be putting the ritual back into drug use. As you're right, people who live in rainforests used mind-altering substances, but they did so contextually, in the context of ritual, of coming of age, of ceremony, and we've lost that. My first taste of cannabis, there was no ritual in that. It was a bunch of guys sitting around coughing their guts up with a plastic bong, whereas I think in most Indigenous cultures, first drug use is far more ritualised, supervised. Part of our education should be a return to that.
The whole thing around rites of passage and initiation, that is missing in our culture. I was a young fellow, like 16, 17, it was all about seeing how much alcohol I could drink. And that was my rite of passage. And if I could drink more than the guy next to me, then I was a bigger man,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the outcome. I think I nearly probably died of alcohol poisoning on more than one occasion. Educating and ritualising and ceremonialising the use of these plant compounds may be a way to give the youth a means of stepping into adulthood and through those rites of passage. And Indigenous cultures have, like you say, have done that. In today's exciting episode, I'm talking with a retired magistrate and Dean of Law at Southern Cross University. And the topics of conversation are drug law reform in Australia, specifically around the changing laws with MDMA and psilocybin becoming available for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And we look at what are the legal implications of that. We also look at harm reduction policies with drug use, the difference between decriminalization and legalization. And then towards the end, we start to talk about issues like freedom of speech. And so if you're interested in drug law reform, psychedelics, freedom of speech, this is a very compelling episode. I encourage you to watch it. So my guest today is a retired magistrate and the Dean of Law at Southern Cross University, an author of 4 published books and an advocate for drug law reform in Australia. Also a fierce advocate for harm reduction in terms of drug use. David Heilpern. Welcome, David.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for agreeing to be on the show. I'm really excited about this episode, and we are going to be talking about drug law reform and, if we get time, a couple of other items on the list.
Sure, looking forward to it.
Awesome. Okay, so I thought I'd just start with how we met, because I've met you a few times before, and we met through my partner, and so my partner Rebecca, and she's quite a fierce advocate for drug law reform in Australia too, and her ex-partner, who was a veteran from the Afghanistan war, he came home with PTSD and was in quite a poor way with his mental health, and she and him, they formed this veteran organisation to advocate for making cannabis available for veterans. And they went down to Canberra and spoke to politicians down there and were instrumental in having cannabis be available to veterans. I think they were the first users of cannabis in Australia for medicine. So, yeah, I think we all share something in common in that we're passionate about drug law reform in Australia. And that's how we met. What I want to discuss today is how your views on drug law reform, but I want to start with something I read in the West Australian newspaper. So I was sitting at one of my favourite cafes about 20 years ago, and on the front page of the West Australian, there was an article by Malcolm McCusker, QC, although KC now, I believe, and he had this comment that we haven't had an intelligent conversation about drugs in Australia for 50 years. So you probably didn't see that article, but I'm wondering, what do you think he was alluding to, and what do you think about having an intelligent conversation about drugs?
An intelligent conversation about drugs starts with what are your goals of drug laws and what are your outcomes. And that has been sorely missing from Australia for decades and decades. So I really agree with him. We have been captured by fear, by United Nations, American-led industry of prohibition. And that has prohibited really sensible discussion. Because sensible discussion starts with, well, drugs alter people's consciousness. They alter their state of mind. That is not an inherently harmful or harmless activity. It's an activity like abseiling or jumping out of aeroplanes with parachutes or deep diving or surfing that need analysis, that maybe need regulation. But that would be the sensible starting point. And because of the prohibition industry, we've been robbed of that. That, in turn, has led to enormous harm. That is, prohibition has led to enormous harm. And the tragedy of drug law in Australia in the last 50 years, and indeed throughout the Western world, has been one of huge rates of imprisonment, discrimination, mostly on the basis of race and class, and a great deal of unnecessary suffering. Those who've gained out of that process have been law enforcement agencies who have grown exponentially in their powers and their numbers and able to influence all of our lives in a negative way. And also, of course, the undercover criminal element who have made an absolute fortune out of drug prohibition. I include in that the pharmaceutical and the alcohol industries who are laughing all the way to the bank as the only legal way to chemically alter your state of consciousness. So we haven't had an intelligent conversation about it for 50 years until probably the last few years, where I think there's a sense of change in the air.
Yeah, there is, and so prohibition hasn't really worked in terms of not only stopping the use of drugs, but also stopping the conversation or having intelligent debate about it. And I think the figure I saw, that America spent $1 trillion on the war on drugs, and it seems to me that drugs are winning that war. And what I mean is that it certainly hasn't decreased use. And so I agree with you that prohibition doesn't work. And what it does do is make a lot of criminally minded people, like the drug cartels, very wealthy. On that point, I just want to share something. I've never publicly disclosed this idea, but I think it's time I did. So the criminalisation of drugs drives the price up. And I want to use cocaine as my example. So in Australia, I think that cocaine's the most expensive anywhere in the world, maybe because we're a long way from Colombia, and maybe for other reasons. But so we pay the most for cocaine in Australia than any other country. And the price of cocaine is about 3 to 4 times the price of gold. So gold's about $2,000 an ounce. Cocaine's about $6,000 to $8,000 an ounce. So this is really interesting, and I don't know if people have thought this through. So I've worked on a gold mine. To get gold, you've got to go out and find gold, and then you've got to drill for gold. Then if you find it, you've got to build a gold mine. Then you've got to build a camp. Then you've got to build a power station to run all that. Then you have to fly people there to work it. So much money goes into, getting this gold out of the ground. Cocaine grows on a bush. Why is cocaine 4 times the price of gold? What are people willing to do in terms of criminal activity to get their hands on gold?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And the profit margin there that you allude to is just so big.
Yeah.
It's so high. For a long time, I've had the completely unevidenced theory that the crime cartels are really happy with the law as it is.
Absolutely they are.
As I say, unevidenced, but the amount of money they stand to lose with decriminalisation, legalisation, medicalisation, whatever you want to call it, is just enormous. And what's left? You know, when I started practicing law, prostitution was illegal, blasphemy was illegal, homosexuality was illegal, abortion was illegal, and I acted for people engaged in all of those illegal activities. They're all legal now. The only real moral crime left is altering your state of consciousness by taking a chemical substance that's not a legal one, that's not coffee or alcohol or pharmaceutical. And as a result, what will these drug cartels turn to? They used to be very involved in prostitution, in a whole range of activities. Abortion was run by, in Australia and no doubt overseas, by criminal cartels. So what are we looking at now? What can they turn to? And the truth is there's not much left. There's not much criminal activity left if we legalise drugs.
Well, unfortunately, you're not 100% correct there, because there's a huge child trafficking ring going on across the southern border of America. And if that's what they turn to, then maybe we should keep drugs illegal.
Well, I think the two things are so closely related.
Right.
There's no doubt that we all know that if you go to your dealer and they haven't got cannabis, then you're likely to get something else. And the point being that once you engage with the criminal milieu, then it crosses into a whole range of other crimes, including sexual slavery. And yes, of course, there is a real problem with that, and the focus may turn to that. But question whether there's the same market for sexual slavery of children as there is for drugs, and I suspect it's a way less.
Yeah.
It's way less.
The demand would be a lot less, hopefully.
You'd hope so.
Yeah, on my point with the cocaine being 4 times the price of gold, it's simple economics, really, and so the price of something is determined by the supply and the demand for it. So there's a huge demand for cocaine, huge. I mean, I don't know if you've tried cocaine, but when I was in Mexico, I tried it, and I thought it was fine. I had a good time. I didn't see there was anything wrong with it, and so I can understand why people want to use it. It's just a central nervous system stimulant, keeps you awake, you can party longer, have a good time. So I don't personally have a problem. And for me, it's never the drug, it's the human interaction with the drug that causes the problem. So there's a huge demand for cocaine worldwide. So if you want to drive the price up, you have to restrict the supply. So how do you restrict the supply? You make it illegal. So it's like you were saying, your point, it's in the drug cartel's interest to have cocaine illegal, because that makes it 4 times the price of gold. The moment you make cocaine, or either not decriminalising wouldn't do it, but if you legalised it, that would drive the drug cartels out of the criminal industry.
Yes, even decriminalisation has been shown worldwide to lessen demand. See, what happens when you decriminalise, that is, take the criminal penalty away. You can still leave civil penalties. You could still have, for example, the crime of supply, but not the crime of possession or use. Then worldwide it's been shown that irresponsible use decreases, even if overall use doesn't decrease. In other words, harmful use decreases, impurities decrease. The whole glam element of something that's unlawful dissipates. And we've seen from the best assessment of cocaine use in Australia is the urine samples that are taken from all of the capital cities. And, the rate of cocaine use is not affected by the number of seizures that they do at borders, or by the number of arrests, or the number of people they send to prison. These are just collateral harms that actually have no impact on use rates. True, when the price goes up, people tend to use less. But the problem is, of course, then they turn to drugs like ice or speed or drugs that have much greater harms than more, quote, natural products like cocaine or cannabis.
Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of having an intelligent conversation, you mentioned that we need to look at goals and outcomes. And what are the goals? Is it to reduce use? And if so, why? Is more drug use necessarily bad? Well, it depends on the use and the outcomes of more drug use. And I think we need to even come back one more step and look at the language before we even look at goals and outcomes, the language around drugs, because just the word drug, it's tainted. We don't even know what we're referring to anymore. So if you say drug use should decrease, well, you go to America, pharmacies are called drugstores. You know, drugs are what the pharmaceutical companies are selling, really, historically. So the word drug comes from the Latin or Greek word drogue, which just means dried herb or dried store. So traditionally drugs have been dried herbs, and that's where the word comes from. But now you say drug, and are you talking about illicit drugs, illegal drugs? Are you talking about plant medicines? Are you talking about pharmaceutical compounds? What are you talking about? So I think language is really important because language creates culture. Culture is made up of language. So if we want to change the culture of drug use, we have to change our language around it. So cocaine and cannabis, to me, are plant medicines. They're not drugs. A drug, to me, well, they can be depending on your definition of drug, and so we have to get clear around that for starters. So I break it down into pharmaceutical products, plant medicines, and then there's a category of illicit drugs that I would put ice, crystal meth in, and that's in there by itself. But everything else to me is either a plant medicine or a pharmaceutical. And 70% of all pharmaceuticals contain some plant component. So it's mostly plant compounds. So another point is that I think we infantilize ourselves by prohibiting our ability to use plant medicines to alter our state of consciousness. You know, for governments to prohibit these things, it's giving the message that you're not smart or intelligent enough to regulate your own use of plant compounds to alter your conscious experience. You are when it comes to alcohol, tea, coffee, cigarettes, but not these other things. So where do we start? You know, we have to get clear about the language, and then we have to look at goals and outcomes. And so we'll leave language aside for a moment and look at what are the goals in terms of drug law reform. I imagine it's to take the criminal element out and to reduce harm. Is that?
Well, those two things really go hand in hand. You know, I think your language point is exactly right, and there's other words that I think we should get rid of in the discourse as well. And you've really hit on one of those, which is the distinction or the non-distinction in my mind between recreational and medicinal use. It's a silly distinction. If someone has a joint before they go to sleep at night so they sleep better, dream well, and are a better lover, well, is that medicinal or is that recreational? You know, like and this whole, I mean, we see it particularly with cannabis, medicinal cannabis good, recreational cannabis bad. But the truth is there's such a huge grey area. In fact, the overlap is complete. So in terms of language, we need to ditch a whole lot of silly terms. Another silly term is gateway drugs. Cannabis is a gateway drug to heavier drugs. These terms like recreational, medicinal, gateway are just outdated and unhelpful. The truth is that there is harmful use and non-harmful use, and if we just stick to that, harmful use, you know, chasing the scream. Which is, such a wonderful book, such a wonderful Jonathan Harry's book about investigating drug use. He says the gateway to harmful drug use is trauma.
Yeah.
And if we start from that basis, then I think the answer to your question, what is the goal of drug law reform, becomes really self-evident. If you get rid of the word drug, you get rid of the whole concept of medicinal recreational, you get rid of the concept of gateway, and just look at harm and what causes harm in the sphere of using medicinal herbs, chemicals, whatever you want, pharmaceuticals, whatever you call them, then it's really simple. What is going to cause the least harm? At the moment, we have a system where literally tens of thousands of people every year are imprisoned for drug laws. And that's just in Australia. You look at places like the United States and you look at places like Mexico on the border We're talking harm all over the place. And in those countries, it's not so much imprisonment as gangs, cartels, deaths, terrorism, state functioning, drug cartels running whole countries. So, we are in a world of harm with what we're doing now, and how can we reduce that harm? The first thing we've got to do is start looking sensibly at decriminalisation and legalisation of drugs wherever appropriate in the West, because it actually knocks the whole system for six. It doesn't increase harmful use. The Portuguese experiment shows that overdoses have almost disappeared. Harmful drug use amongst young people under the age of 18, has decreased. Overall, drug use has remained pretty much the same, but without the imprisonment, without without the harm, without the overdoses, without the abuse, a far more medicinal twinge than recreational, really, because as we discussed before, the glory and the glamour and the crime cartels and any pushing, which is a terrible term, but you know what I mean, is gone. And that's how we should be moving. Now, if I was modelling for just cocaine, for example, well, we should have an industry here. Why don't we have an industry here? There's no reason we can't grow cocaine here. It doesn't have to be grown in South America, or Central America. So we have an industry here, and people who want it can use it. And we have regulation like we do for tobacco. People under the age of 18 shouldn't be able to get it and use it and abuse it. We should have great education programs about the pluses and minuses of this drug, particularly for people with pacemakers or heart conditions, about not using too much, about looking after yourself in the days before and after. All of those things are just common sense. So I think that all drug law reform should be focused on harm reduction, and the best method of harm reduction is legalisation, decriminalisation, regulation, medicalization, a mix of all of the above. And let's feel our way and work through each of those steps.
Yeah, you mentioned the Portugal experiment, and so they went with the decriminalisation model.
Yes.
And as you said, it hasn't increased drug use, and in some demographics maybe even decreased drug use. And I think it certainly reduced their prison population and improved treatment outcomes.
Yes, about a third less prisoners.
Yeah, that's a big saving, because it costs between 100 and 150,000 a year to keep someone in prison.
Yeah, and I'm always reminded too of the pain and the agony. I mean, I spent a lot of my years going to prison and talking to people who are in prison, and these are institutions of pain.
I worked in prisons for 10 years as a nurse in maximum security, so yeah, I know. And prison's not the place for someone who's in there for drug use.
And they tend to be at the trauma end. How many people in prison for drugs don't have a trauma background? Very few.
Yeah, correct. And I agree with that. That trauma is the gateway to a lot of people using drugs, and that they're looking to medicate their trauma, and that some of the drugs that are illegal currently are the best treatments for trauma, which is...
also, I think we can compare it to some other things. I think, to me, a really interesting comparison is the outbreak of something that, if it existed when I was young, I didn't know about it, but certainly has increased, and that's cutting and self-harming, particularly by teenage young women. It's not criminalised. It's actually not a crime to harm yourself in that way. In fact, you can cut off your own arm and it's not a crime. And we're dealing with that in a really a different approach. Why is it illegal to smoke a joint when you're a teenager and having a trauma or having all the angst that often goes along with teenage years? But it's not a crime to self-harm by slashing up your arms. And the answer is because we know that there are better ways of dealing with this. What, are we really going to lock up people for self-harming? No, of course we don't. We don't lock up people who starve themselves either. All of these are trauma-type responses or responses to external or internal stimuli for which drugs may well be even those drugs that are now illicit may well be a far better remedy, but they're illegal.
So you maybe you could explain the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation. I mean, I think I understand it, although it's a little confusing. But maybe you could clarify those two.
Sure. Look, the two terms are used interchangeably. Different countries actually have slightly different definitions of them. But I think that the best way to look at it is by using example. Canberra, the ACT, that's the capital city of Australia, in case we're international audiences, has just decriminalised possession of all drugs. They have a fine system, so there's still a penalty, but that penalty doesn't give you a criminal record, can't lead you to jail, and is the equivalent, and you don't get a criminal record as a result. That's decriminalisation. In other words, taking the crime, but not necessarily all of the penalty out of it. Legalisation is probably best seen by what we have with tobacco. It's legal, but it's regulated. So that's the difference. And people often think legalisation means a free-for-all. We don't have a free-for-all with alcohol. We don't have a free-for-all with tobacco. And they're the two main legal drugs in Australia. So really, I think the best way to understand it is a three-tier. There is criminalisation, there is decriminalisation, and then there's legalisation. But regulation comes in at all points.
Yeah, I agree. I think regulation is an important part. No matter which path we choose, we need to regulate. So another thing around this for me is education. So if you're going to change a culture, you've got to start with your young folk, because they're the next generation coming through. It's all right for guys in our generation to sit around and talk about drug law reform, but what are the kids who are going to be introduced to drugs at some point in their life? Are they being informed or not? And they're not being informed. So I remember when I was at school, I learned about trigonometry. I haven't come across trigonometry since year 10. I've never seen it. I didn't learn about drugs, and I've been exposed to drugs a lot in my life. So why are we educating children about stuff they're not going to use, but not educating them about things that they will encounter and need to be educated about? So my drug education when I was in high school, and it hasn't changed because I asked my nephews and nieces this, they had a ex-heroin addict and a uniformed police officer come in and give a 30-minute talk on drug use, and it was basically drugs are bad, drugs are evil, stay away or you'll go to jail.
Yeah.
That's not a drug education.
That's the South Park approach. Say no to drugs. And yet at the very first Mardi Gras, we had a T-shirt which was say no, K-N-O-W, to drugs. And I mean, it's a bit of a pun, but it's also a really important measure. And while drugs are illegal, while we have a blanket criminalisation of drugs, then it's impossible to educate because they're illegal. You can't do them because they're against the law. And no teacher and no educator, except the brave ones, are going to say, well, when you do, make sure you drink enough water, make sure you call a friend, make sure you've got someone responsible on tap, make sure when you eat the mushrooms out of the paddock that you know about purging. There's a whole range of things that are really important that we should be teaching people, and criminalisation gets in the way. Once you get to decriminalisation or legalisation with regulation, education becomes really important. And I think the most models and most proponents of decriminalisation or legalisation always say the same thing, and it's a really good lesson, and that is this: just take 1/10 of the enforcement dollars and put it into education, and you'll probably be spending 100 times more than you expect on drug education. And that's why legalisation, if properly done, and decriminalisation, if the money is spent on education, that is saved on enforcement, that's saved on imprisonment, that's saved on harm and mental illness and all the rest of it, and on welfare, then if that's directed into education, then the outcomes are so much better than our existing models.
I think we're neglecting our young by not educating them about drugs, because they will be exposed to them. And if they're not educated, then they're vulnerable and at risk. I was just thinking just then about, I wonder how they handle this in indigenous rainforest, tribes. I'm sure they don't punish them for using a plant compound. They probably have the shaman there who educates people around which plants are food, which are medicines, which are poisons. I doubt they have a punitive approach. And so maybe it is about educating our youth about drugs. But as you were saying, I take your point, teachers aren't going to educate kids about that while drugs are illegal because, well, it would probably cost them their job.
Well, I think part of the education also needs to be putting the ritual back into drug use. Most, as you're right, people who live in rainforests, native Australians used mind-altering substances, but they did so contextually in the context of ritual, of coming of age, of ceremony, and we've lost that. Because classically, my first taste of cannabis, there was no ritual in that. It was a bunch of guys sitting around coughing their guts up with a plastic bong, whereas I think in most Indigenous cultures, first drug use is far more ritualised, supervised, and is part of a process. And part of our education should be a return to that. One of the great things, I know we haven't come to it yet, but one of the great things about the Australian jump into the ability to prescribe psilocybin and MDMA is the fact that all the people that are talking about the use of it, it's ritual. They're talking about it beforehand. They're talking about soft music, iPads, a couple of support people around. They're talking about a whole range of things that smack of ritual use. I know they're cloaking it in medicalization, in getting well, but the truth is it mimics the kind of rituals for which drug use is like an ayahuasca ceremony or some of those things. Ayahuasca, ceremony, for example.
That's a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up. The whole thing around rites of passage and initiation, and that is missing in our culture. And what we do instead, when I was a young fellow, like 16, 17, it was all about seeing how much alcohol I could drink. And that was my rite of passage. And if I could drink more than the guy next to me, then I was a bigger man,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the outcome. I think I nearly probably died of alcohol poisoning on more than one occasion. And so that's just through lack of education. But we do need rites of passage, and educating and ritualising and ceremonialising the use of these plant compounds may be a way to give the youth a means of stepping into adulthood and through those rites of passage. And Indigenous cultures have, like you say, have done that. And we've made it a moral thing. We seem to have made drugs immoral rather than looking at them as... The drug itself is inert. It doesn't have a moral or immoral, it's just a substance. It's just a compound. It's our relationship to it is where we come unstuck. And so we're not we'll blame the drug. Oh, you can't do this because this is a bad drug. No, it's my overuse of that or my using that in a harmful way that's the problem, not the compound itself. And so these things like cannabis, ayahuasca, cocaine, they're all plant compounds gifted to us by nature, and they're medicines in one dose and poisons in another. So when I studied pharmacology at uni, one of the lecturers said the difference between a medicine and a poison is the dose. And that's even if you're talking about water, if you can overdose on water and die. So these plant compounds are medicinal in one dose, but toxic and poison in another. And so this is why we need to look at educating people around when and where to use certain plant compounds, set and setting, rites of passage, safe dosage, purity. It's really about education, and that's really lacking. And we can talk about it at the end of at this end of legalising or decriminalising, but unless we're educating our youth, then we're not covering the whole field, are we?
We're not. And, I think the moral aspect or the moral argument is a really interesting one, and there's a whole thesis in that. But I'm sure you've seen those fantastical propaganda, anti-cannabis advertisements from the United States, it's actually all about sex. They don't want people to have sex, and you can edit this out if you will.
I'll leave it in. I'll leave it in.
But I did a tour many years ago for what was then called the National Union of Students, talking about legalisation of cannabis, and I did a nationwide campus tour. And I used to start my lecture by saying, if you want to understand drug laws, you've got to understand this joke. Why do fundamentalist Christians hate fucking standing up? And the answer is because it leads to dancing. And the truth is that a lot of our drug laws are about stopping dancing or wanton sex, or, there's a whole moral Victorian era prude-ishness to wanting to criminalise drugs that is inherent in the prohibition movement. It's no wonder that one of the last bastions for complete prohibition is the Salvation Army. They carry their moral badge in the arms of prohibition. I think it is really interesting, and the truth is that there's a lot more irresponsible sex and a lot more sexual assault that is engendered around alcohol than there is, for example, around cannabis. The former tends to lead to aggression. It tends to lead to a lack of inhibition in quite inappropriate manners when it comes to sexuality. Whereas cannabis tends to lead to, loving, mellow kindness, if you like. So they're part of the harm reduction that I believe in.
Yeah, alcohol's the most interesting one for me. I've worked in emergency departments for 10 years as well as a nurse, and on any Friday or Saturday night, most of what's coming through the door is alcohol-related trauma, by a long way. And you can even look at the graphs and statistics on emergency room presentations in relation to drug. And alcohol is head and shoulders above. In fact, if you added up every other drug or chemical or pharmaceutical compound, it wouldn't come close to what alcohol does. So these graphs are quite impressive. If you look at things like mushrooms or MDMA, like they barely even rate on those graphs. And so alcohol, the legal drug, not only is it legal, I mean, it's advertised and promoted, and yet it's the one causing the most harm. So if harm reduction is one of our goals, then we would be looking at reducing alcohol use and maybe increasing the use of some of these other substances, but like you say, in an educated, ritualistic, rites of passage, set and setting way. Yeah, you mentioned there's been a recent change in the scheduling of two compounds in Australia. I think Mind Medicine Australia lobbied pretty hard, the TGA, and rightfully so, to reschedule MDMA and psilocybin from Schedule 9 of the Poisons Act, which is a poison, to Schedule 8, which is a controlled substance. And that made it available now for authorised psychiatrists to be able to prescribe psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression in a context of terminal illness, and MDMA for PTSD. So in some way, Australia is kind of leading the field internationally by changing those schedules. And so that's opened the Pandora's box a little, hasn't it? And I'm interested in your thoughts around, what are the legal implications, or what are some of the legal implications now for the fact that authorised prescribers can prescribe these compounds? And are there legal things that we need to be looking at and considering as this unfolds? I believe the first patient was treated just this week at a clinic down in Melbourne. So have we got the legal framework sorted out to make sure that this goes well in terms of the opening up of these compounds?
Look, I think the legal framework is good and sound, and I'm excited by the development. I'm upset by the poo-pooing of this by the research industry, by the organised psychiatric industry, and by some other agencies, including AMAs in some Australian medical associations in some states. If they were, this is an extraordinary and an exciting development that is going to enable real research to be done and real access over time. Now, I know that there's a few critiques of it. Firstly, the expense and the difficulty of getting there. Look, we saw this with cannabis. When cannabis was very first legalised or permitted, it was only for such limited conditions and in such limited circumstances and right on the edge of criminalisation and medicalisation. But it soon expanded into what we've got now, which is over 350,000 prescriptions. You know, it took a few years, but it got there. So what was elitist and a very narrow band has now expanded. And we'll see that with MDMA and psilocybin in time. The pushback's been extraordinary against this change, but it seems the government and the TGA are standing firm and people are starting up clinics and starting the treatment. It's now possible for people to import the drugs or get hold of the drugs to enable people to take the medicinal dose, and I think we're going to start to see the same kind of stories publicised of this changed my life, but in a legal way so that people can be identified and people can tell their story, and that will create a cascading effect. So I'm very excited by it. Of course, the researchers have had the carpet pulled out from beneath them because many of them were running placebo trials. In other words, half the people weren't getting the substance. How you can do that with MDMA or psilocybin has always been slightly amusing to me, in the sense that unless people are just faking it, you really do know if you've had one of those two drugs. And they're leading the pushback, but I don't think they'll succeed. Of course, the elephant in the room is the fact that we're still imprisoning such huge numbers and the criminal law hasn't changed for these drugs. Now, with psilocybin, for example, these substances vary from state to state, but suffice it to say we're talking minuscule amounts of less than a gram lead to presumptions against bail, lead to terms of imprisonment. And there are hundreds, thousands of Australians sitting in jail now for psilocybin and MDMA, and the criminal law needs to rapidly catch up with the medicinal changes, and it will. We saw this with cannabis. New South Wales has been the laggard, but has just decriminalised a range of possession offences for cannabis, and the ACT has decriminalised possession now of all drugs, including psilocybin and MDMA. Queensland are in the process of doing the same. So medicalisation, as we've seen, is not without its critics, but it's a fantastic development that will lead to harm reduction in all sorts of ways. And if the AMAs and the psychiatrists associations and the researchers would be true to their values, which is reducing harm, then they would be entirely supportive of this and working hand in hand with those brave doctors who are at the forefront of prescribing.
There's an amusing anecdote in terms of the legality of psilocybin, because there'd be hundreds of farmers in this area alone that have got kilos of psilocybin mushrooms in their paddocks. Why are they not being charged with possession?
Well, because it's a funny thing. We used to have quite a lot of parties at our house, and of course people would throw their joints in the compost bucket, and then we'd throw the compost out, and of course you have cannabis plants growing in your compost. This is a North Coast problem that existed throughout since 1973, I'm sure. But you don't actually possess it until you know it's there, until you know what it is. Once you harvest it, of course, then you possess it.
Okay.
So if it's just sitting out in the paddocks and they don't know what it is, and they're not doing anything with it, then they're probably not possessing it or cultivating it.
Okay.
But once they pick it, dry it, and start selling it at the corner store, then they're in trouble.
I'm quite sceptical, but I think that's an improvement on being naive, so I don't mind the fact that I'm sceptical. And if I look at psilocybin and MDMA, and both those compounds have been locked away for the last 30 years at least, in Schedule 9, which says that they have no medicinal benefit, that they're dangerous, And so both those compounds, nobody can own the patent on either of them. Psilocybin because nature made it, so you can't patent nature. And then MDMA because the patent expired in 1914. So my skepticism says, well, maybe the reason these two compounds have been locked away and not allowed for treatment is that nobody can profit from them, and that maybe they're in competition with some of the pharmaceutical compounds treating things like trauma and depression and these kind of things. There's quite a bit of anecdotal evidence coming out now that microdosing psilocybin, so we're not even talking a psychoactive dose, in fact like 1/10 of a psychoactive dose, is very good for treating depression. It elevates mood. It has no adverse effects, and so that's quite good in terms of treating mood disorders. And there's plenty of evidence now that MDMA is very effective, more effective than any other approach for treating PTSD. All the work that Rick Doblin's done with MAPS in California, I think he had something like 80% success rate in treating veterans for PTSD after, I think, 1 or 2 sessions. They didn't qualify for the diagnosis anymore. And so my skepticism leads me to believe that the reasons these things have been prohibited is because they're competing with things like antidepressants, antipsychotics, benzodiazepines, and other pharmaceutical products. So I'm excited from the point of view of that these two compounds are being medicalised and made available, because I believe they're both very safe and very effective treatments for, two very debilitating mental health issues. And one of my criticisms of psychiatry is that, over the years, psychiatry's had very little to offer people for things like anxiety, depression and trauma. And what happened is the whole underground industry has come up with very effective and very safe treatments. So CBD treats anxiety very well. Microdosing psilocybin treats mood disorders very well. And then MDMA treats trauma well. Now that that's clear, now psychiatry wants to capture that market and own it. And I don't have a problem with that. I'm just speaking as to how I see it in terms of competition for dollars and profits.
I totally agree with you. The medical model for treating anxiety, say, and depression is to give people a pill every day for the rest of their life. But of course, the way it works is you've still got to go back to the doctor every 2 scripts, and often back to the psychiatrist as well. So this is repeat business. And the really terrifying thing, I think, for the pharmaceutical and the medical industry, I'm talking here doctors and psychiatrists, is that on all the models, leaving aside microdosing for a moment, on all the models, it's 1 or 2 macrodoses, for want of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
And then people are better. That's the theory.
Yep.
So this is not a great medical model in comparison, for profit at least, or making a living. This is not a great medical model in comparison to giving people a pill every day that they need to keep coming back for. So I think it is threatening, and it is a reason why these agencies oppose such change. But the beauty of the underground movement is that it has shown enough people that this works, and the pressure is on. The first clinic that's opened in Melbourne had thousands of people making inquiries.
I saw that.
Even though it's $25,000 for the treatment. So there is, this is supply and demand. I think the other thing is that, is the lack of efficiency, the true lack of worth of ongoing SSRI medication is really starting to ring true for most people. The people who are taking the pill, the antidepressant, every day, expecting to do so with the same effect, the same results for the rest of their life without terrible side effects, in comparison to doing some MDMA in a certain setting, doing some psilocybin, I think the proof is in.
That's a very good point. I think both those medicines have the potential to be curative So not just treatment, but actually curative. And once you're no longer depressed or once you no longer have PTSD, you don't need any pharmaceuticals. And so I take that's not the best business model if you're looking at long-term profits. Yeah. So I just want to go over to the MAID laws in Canada. These are quite alarming. I'm sure you've looked into it a little bit. So it's the medical assistance in dying laws.
Yeah.
Quite alarming if you look at that stuff. So a point I have is that in Canada, people with treatment-resistant depression and people with PTSD, that's treatment-resistant, are being offered medical assistance in dying. So if they're depressed and they go and take antidepressants, SSRIs, it doesn't work. They do talk therapy, it doesn't work. They have ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, that doesn't work. Well, okay, you're treatment-resistant, we can offer you euthanasia.
Yep.
Now, my position on this is that they're not treatment resistant, they're treatment deprived because they haven't yet had access to psilocybin and MDMA. And so I believe that's what's true in Canada is also true here. And so I certainly don't want to go down the Canadian path of offering people with treatment resistant depression and PTSD an exit through euthanasia when they haven't yet had access to psilocybin or MDMA. And this is something that, I think we need to be advocating for. And so I don't know where Canada's going with that. I don't know where they are in terms of psilocybin and MDMA. I think your point around research is awesome. By decriminalising it and these clinics opening up, we're actually going to have real data based on real people doing the real medicine in the right context, in the right setting, rather than these laboratory, run research clinical trials. There was one done in WA recently that had only 4 participants. So I appreciate the effort of having a clinical trial, but that's not really going to give us any viable data.
Well, if we spent the money that's being spent, Woke Pharmaceuticals, great name, is spending $5 million on a psilocybin treatment-resistant depression study. Well, if that $5 million went into actually treating people on prescription through a psychiatrist and a clinic, well, what better research can you get rather than having half the people getting a placebo? That is absurd. I think, to me, the issue is not, incidentally, in Canada, that part of the legislation was suspended until this year, the mental health euthanasia, and has now just been extended to 2027, the exemption. In other words, it's not available still in Canada. But I think the point is well made, and that, to me, is this. When I was young, and no doubt when you were young, the biggest cause of death, for example, for 18 to 25-year-old males was car accidents.
Correct.
Now for 18 to 40-year-old males and for 18 to 25-year-old females, it's suicide.
Yeah.
So people are voting with their feet, to put it graphically. They're not coping with their mental illness. And leaving euthanasia aside, which is only going to touch a really small percentage, people are actually euthanizing themselves by jumping off cliffs and driving into trees, by overdosing on drugs, and by shooting themselves. And the tragedy that we have the peak bodies for psychiatric health in Australia opposing what could be a viable treatment for a significant number of those people. I mean, it really beggars belief. In fact, it makes me angry that people would oppose this in circumstances where, and there's one thing that's really clear, despite what some of the researchers say, these are safe drugs if administered set and setting and with proper weeding out of people susceptible to other ailments. So what we've got is a safe, viable, inexpensive, accessible treatment potential that could save lives. I mean, if you and I see in our lifetime widespread use of MDMA and psilocybin for the conditions we're talking about, I think we'll see a mass reduction in suicide. I'm interested to see what comes out of the Veteran Royal Commission on suicides. Of course, cannabis is an important part of that process. But I often wonder if we opened firstly to veterans psilocybin and MDMA as a free treatment, depending on their conditions, whether we would see a real impact on the suicide rates of those traumatised people who were traumatised in the service of their country. I think we would. I think we'd see a mass reduction in suicide rates, and therefore so much less harm in our society. Suicide is not just harmful, of course, for the perpetrator, for the person who dies. It's so harmful for the family and the children and everyone else. So I'd love to see this first expanded to veterans, and I reckon the results would be outstanding.
Yeah, I agree with you, absolutely. So one of the outcomes we're looking at is a reduction in suicide. You know, if you're saying that we need to look at what are the outcomes we're looking for. In America, the statistics are 22 veterans a day commit suicide. And then Rick Doblin's work at MAPS showed an 80% success rate in treating PTSD. So, yeah, certainly America should be giving all their veterans free treatment of MDMA therapy. And I think, that his phase 3 clinical trial results came out about 4 years ago. It was pre-COVID, and they're still dragging their feet in making it available. Like, the wheels of bureaucracy turn very slowly, even when you've got the data. And then my other question is, like, and I don't know if you have an opinion on this, if America's done these amazing clinical trials, why do we need to repeat the trials in Australia? Are our veterans that different to US veterans? Is our trauma different? Is our MDMA different? Why are we repeating these trials?
Well, there's a research industry in Australia that profits from repeating trials and mimicking trials. I mean, I think the classic example of this is over-the-counter CBD. The proposal is that people are able, without a prescription, well, it's not a proposal, it's LAW law, that without a prescription, people should be able to, are able to buy CBD oil over the counter with a minimal amount of THC. When I say minimal, I can't remember the exact percent. But the requirement for companies to be able to engage in this is that they have to engage in clinical trials. And so we're years behind mainland Europe, for example, where every town has a dispensary where you can get CBD. Why do we need to repeat the research? Why do we need to repeat the research over and over again? I mean, there are some areas where there does need to be more research. For example, I was looking at the use of MDMA or psilocybin for alcoholism. Now, there's no phase 3 trials on that. There's no even large-scale phase 2 trials on that. And there should be. This is an important area of research. And mind you, the results so far are incredibly promising, as you'd expect, because it really shifts the mind. So there are areas that need research, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel every single time. What I find amusing about it, in a way, not amusing, but amusing, is that if these were brand new drugs that someone invented, they'd never been illicit, they'd never been associated with hippie culture, wild sex parties or anything else, they'd be legal and available right now. We're not afraid of legalising and making available for prescription mind-altering substances. Think Valium. I mean, there's something that's mind-altering, that impacts your driving, that is addictive, that has negative side effects, and yet is available at the stroke of a pen from a doctor without any wild objection from anybody. It's only because these drugs once had an illicit flavour that we're even remotely concerned about them. And that's the outrage, is that just because something was once illegal, we're putting barriers up that should never have been there. And for those of us who experimented with mushrooms in the 1970s and 1980s, the illegality was unknown. I mean, I had no idea they were illegal then. So there was hardly any deterrent effect. And, I'm still standing. Most of us are.
Yeah, one of the criticisms of decriminalising or legalising drugs is that it will increase drug use. Now, that's assuming that an increase in drug use is a bad thing, isn't it?
It is.
An increase in drug use is only a problem if more drug use is necessarily bad. But if people are taking medicines, plant medicines, to improve their health and well-being, to treat their mood disorders, their anxiety, and their trauma, then maybe increased drug use is what we actually need.
Well, the Dalai Lama was asked, is drug use a shortcut to enlightenment? And he answered, I certainly hope so. So, you know, there's nothing per se wrong with increased drug use. And I mean, the revolutionary increase in drug use over the last 20 years has been in pharmaceuticals to treat mental illness. And nobody is saying, oh my God, there's more people out there using drugs. And you're right, it's the kind of drugs, it's the set and setting, and it's the dosage. And the truth is, while people, I'm sure, can overuse MDMA and psilocybin, the reality is that it's not. There's no history of addiction to either of those drugs in the sense of people, you know, suffering withdrawals and all the rest of it. So there's a self-fulfilling end to the use of those drugs if used properly with a couple of sessions.
Yeah,
I don't think there's no history anywhere in the world of increased problematic drug use by decriminalisation or legalisation. There's some increase in experimentation. There's some increase in regular use by certain age groups. But in terms of harm, there's no increased harm as a result of decriminalisation or legalisation that I've seen.
So no increased harm. And so then if we look at the safety profile of psilocybin and MDMA, statistically, a therapeutic dose of MDMA, which is 1.5 milligrams per kilogram, is safer than a glass of wine or riding a horse, statistically.
Yep.
But we don't, make those two things illegal. So there's no issue with the safety of MDMA in a therapeutic dose in the right set and setting.
And yet the research industry, I read recently, claim horrendous results. Claim 10 to 20% of people who use psilocybin have a bad trip, with all the words that are encountered around that. And they say that occurs within clinical trials. Now, I just don't believe those numbers to start with.
Yeah.
But if people find things difficult when using psilocybin and work through trauma and issues, then that's a really weird definition of bad trip.
Yeah, look, I'm glad you brought that up because I've got my own opinion about what a bad trip is, and I've done quite a lot of psychedelics in my life. I travelled to Peru, Mexico many times, Costa Rica, so I've gone to these places where psychedelics are not illegal, and I've experimented quite a lot with those. And so what I found that psychedelics do is they tend to take down the mask, the persona, and reveal what's behind the persona or the mask, which is what Jung referred to as the shadow. So when you use psychedelics, they're revealing your whole soul to you, not just the part you're happy with, but the hidden dark bits in there. So when people say I had a bad trip, I'm like, no, you didn't have a bad trip. You just had some of your shadow revealed to you and you're uncomfortable with it and you didn't like it and you don't know what to do with it and you don't know how to integrate it. So even though they're saying, I did psilocybin and I had a bad trip, we need to recontextualize that comment. It's not a bad trip. What do you mean by a bad trip? What did you see? How did you feel about what you saw? Can we use that, in a way to make you healthier and better rather than seeing that as a negative thing? So this is a whole separate conversation, but one I want to do a podcast on is that really psychedelic integration is shadow integration. So all these things are doing is when they open our mind up is they're showing us our dark side, and that's good. There's a populist example of that, which is Goop, which you may have seen, Gwyneth Paltrow's. I think I saw one episode of that.
Yeah, she takes all her staff down to Mexico or South America, Central America somewhere, and gives them a mushroom. And some of those people have real past trauma that gets brought up.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you could say, that person's having a bad trip. on the other hand, interviewed afterwards, they say it was one of the most cathartic and meaningful experiences of their life. No one calls it a bad trip when you go to a psychotherapist and you end up in tears, screaming and crying about your past trauma. And yet suddenly this becomes a bad trip. And of course, we're all used to the movies where in the 1970s, LSD, bad trip, was portrayed as going mental and never recovering from that. And look, maybe there's a minuscule case of that. I don't know.
Yeah.
But reality is that people who are doing psilocybin or MDMA in therapeutic environments are having positive life experiences in them, whether they be easy or hard. To get fit, we climb mountains, we puff, we pant, we ache, it hurts. There's not a lot of difference between that and where we need to go mentally and emotionally often to get from despair to more moderate happiness.
So to kind of sum it up, the decriminalisation or legalisation of drugs has lots of advantages in terms of we can kind of guarantee purity of the substance, which you can't do when it's illegal. We could bring the cost down. We could regulate it. The government could make tax revenue off it. We could control set and setting. We could increase funding for education and treatment programs. We could decrease the cost of imprisonment. We can decrease suicide rates. Like, there's so many pluses. I don't see too many negatives other than the arguments around possible harm. And there is possible harm, but we can even control that in a regulated market by vetting people and assessing them for their suitability for certain substances. What's a medicine for one person might be a poison for another. So I agree it does need to be regulated in the same way that, other substances are like Valium's regulated. My other comment I wanted to make was in terms of alcohol. So if alcohol was invented today, there was no way it would be made legal. It was grandfathered in, wasn't it, from the beginning of time?
That's right. And, and I think that we can look at, for example, our First Nations communities who have no anthropological, historical use of any alcohol substances and what it's done culturally, physically, environmentally, spiritually to their communities. And you'd have to ask yourself, well, should we be letting cannabis and kava in as opposed to this level of despair? I don't know the answer to that. But alcohol has caused so much harm in those communities, which are now Aboriginal people are the most imprisoned race in the world. This is a national disaster, largely at the feet of alcohol. So let's look at other options, and I'm sure that trauma in those communities will be far better treated once we have widespread availability of psychedelic-assisted therapy.
Yeah, your point on when MDMA and psilocybin become available, for them to be available to veterans, I have this idea too that it'd be great to take a team of practitioners and therapists and doctors and psychologists up to Arnhem Land, where the suicide rates among teenagers are astronomical, like 10 times, I think, the normal rate, and give some of these Indigenous youth, treatment for their trauma so that we can, slow down that suicide rate as well. So,
and internationally, I can't remember if it was Timothy Leary who talked about putting MDMA in the water in war zones, but, it's got to be better than what we're doing now.
Chemical warfare.
Yeah, well, chemical love. I think, and why not have psychedelic-assisted therapy available in prisons? I mean, the factories of trauma and the results of trauma. Let's start there.
Yeah,
at the moment we're starting with the rich who can afford it, or people who have benefactors, or people who go underground and utilise some of the brilliant available services that are not regulated, that work as a cottage industry. But soon, I think we're on the cusp of something really exciting, which is the availability throughout the community. And as you say, where on earth are the negatives in that? Well, I guess there'll be a few police who might need to investigate domestic violence rather than drugs. I don't see that as a negative. There might be a few pharmaceutical companies that make slightly less profits, that clear slightly less country or pump out slightly less gases from their factories making antidepressants. Well, I don't see that as really a negative. And there'd be a lot more smiling people around.
I think we're like-minded on most of these issues, if not all of them, David. If you've got a bit more time, I'd like to digress a little bit to a couple of other points
Sure.
I wanted to bring up.
Yeah,
just
sure.
while I've got your
Definitely.
So we'll move away from drug law reform, and because there's a couple of other things that are on my mind. It's around freedom of speech. I don't know your views on freedom of speech. I'm a real proponent for freedom of speech, and the first thing I want to talk about is in regard to the recent Voice campaign that we had here in Australia, where the government was attempting to give a voice to the Indigenous people to Parliament, and that got voted down by about 60 to 40, I believe. And so I don't know the repercussions of that, or whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know how to unpack that. I do know that there were some Indigenous people that even said that they voted no rather than yes, and I don't know what would have transpired had it gone the other way. My point of view on this is that while that conversation was going on, and it was a pretty public conversation around giving, a voice to 4% of the Australian population, there's another piece of legislation that's being passed in Parliament. That's the Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill 2023, where the government is trying to legislate through the ACMA, the Australian Communication and Media Authority, to impose huge fines on social media companies that allow people to publish comments that are maybe against the mainstream narrative of the government of the day, and that ACMA get to decide what is misinformation, what is disinformation, and what is harm. And so the way I look at that, and it might be my own sceptical point of view, is that while the government is wanting to be seen to be doing the right thing by giving a voice to 4% of the population, over here they're trying to take away freedom of speech to 100% of the population. So I'm not sure if you see that the same way, but I think this misinformation, disinformation bill is very alarming, and I think it's going to erode our freedom of speech in this country. And we currently don't have freedom of speech enshrined in our constitution. And I'm wondering if maybe the right referendum to have is freedom of speech for all Australians. And do you have an opinion as to whether we should have a referendum to enshrine freedom of speech in our constitution or not?
Certainly we should have a Bill of Rights, and part of that Bill of Rights should include freedom of speech. We do have what's called the implied freedom of speech, which is where the High Court has said part of our democratic process is that that is established by the Constitution, voting, Houses of Parliament, government, etc., implies that there be freedom of political communication. And attempts to shut that down have been overturned by the High Court. But this is really second-rate Bill of Rights, that it contains a freedom of speech provision in it, whether it be part of the Constitution like in the United States or part of the common law like in England. But the truth is that a wishy-washy, who knows where the limits are, established by judges as they change in the High Court, is really like, riding a push bike up a big hill when you've got an electric car sitting next to you. And the electric car is a Bill of Rights. And we should have one. And part of that would be a freedom of speech that would ensure that we're not talking about the ability to, the freedom of speech, even in America, is not unfettered. Because we still have hate crimes, we still have defamation laws, and there are some limits that have been set by the Supreme Court and inherent in the Bill of Rights itself in America. But that's a far superior model to what we've got, and ensures that bills like the one you're referring to would be struck down if they infringed on people's freedom to speak their minds where there was no discernible harm. I mean, no one believes that in an unfettered freedom of speech. I shouldn't have the power to take photos of, a man shouldn't have the power to take photos of his girlfriend in intimate moments and then put it all over the net. That's not freedom of speech. That's abuse. It's hate crime. Similarly, racial or vilification. There's a whole range of things that or defamatory statements. But outside those limits, we should have a Bill of Rights and a freedom of speech, and that should enable people. I disagree with sovereign citizens, for example, people who say they're not bound by the laws because they're sovereign and etc. I disagree with some of the anti-vax stuff that was out there saying that, if you vaccinate, then you're getting radiation in your system. But do I want to stop these people speaking? No. I mean, that would just be... Leonard Cohen says, there's a crack where the light gets in, and that's what we need. So I'm totally in favour of a Bill of Rights encompassing a freedom of speech and other rights, the rights to congregate, the rights to protest, a whole range of other rights that I think we need.
What's the pathway, David? How do we get a Bill of Rights in Australia?
2 states, Victoria and Queensland, have a Bill of Rights. And to legislate outside that, there has to be a specific vote of Parliament to do so. In Queensland, sadly, we recently saw this, where the ability to imprison young people for crimes, they passed an exception to the Bill of Rights legislation. But it's very, very rare. So some states are leading the way. There was a movement in the 1980s and again in the 1990s for a Bill of Rights in Australia. People are pretty scared of it. It would require constitutional change. And if there's one lesson from The Voice, it is that constitutional change doesn't happen easily in Australia. The history of referendums are pretty sad. So the pathway is long-term, slow lobbying, and maybe some star cases where not having a Bill of Rights leads to real injustice, or some pieces of legislation that people, like the one you've referred to, that people uprise against, cry out for change, and it leads to the establishment of a Bill of Rights, including the freedom of speech. But it's going to be a long pathway, and if I was a gambling person, I'd say chances in my lifetime very slim.
So thank you for that answer. So let me just push you a little bit on that. So are you against a referendum for
I'm not
freedom of speech being enshrined in the Australian Constitution?
Not at all.
Okay.
As long as there's some prospect of success. Because failure just ensures inaction for a longer period of time. And we saw that with constitutional change, for example, to get rid of the monarchy and to become a republic.
Okay. So maybe
we lost that.
So maybe one of the first steps is to poll the public and to see if the public are in favour of enshrining freedom of speech in the Constitution before you expend the money on the referendum.
And not just the money, but failure just leads to decades of inaction. So
you think the Bill of Rights is the better option than the referendum?
Look, I think the states will universally pass them, and I think that's a great start. There's 2 kinds of Bills of Rights. One is ones that Parliament pass. That's all very well, but parliaments can get around it by a bare majority, or even they can legislate for a 2/3 majority. But a Bill of Rights means that in the Constitution means that parliaments can't legislate around it, and the High Court's the guardian with the big stick saying, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, I know where I stand on that. I think the referendum, like you say, it's got to have a chance of success, but I'd like to see the freedom of speech enshrined in our Constitution. And on that, I want to go to my last topic of conversation. It's quite a topical one at the moment. Julian Assange is in Belmarsh prison in the UK. He's been there for 5 years, pretty much in solitary confinement with declining mental and physical health, having never been charged with anything under UK law. Before that, he was imprisoned, house arrest or political asylum, whatever you call it, in the Ecuadorian embassy for 7 years. So he's basically been under house arrest for 12 or 13 years now. And he's been charged in the US under the Espionage Act of, I think, 1917. So that act's over 100 years old. They didn't even have the internet back then. And his charges are that he disclosed on the internet, basically some video evidence and a bunch of other leaked documents, but showing some what appeared to be war crimes. And so he's a journalist who was doing his job and was leaking information that was passed on to him. And he's now sitting in a UK prison. He's an Australian citizen. I think next week there's the High Court ruling on whether he gets extradited to the US. If that goes through, he's facing 175 years in jail, possible torture, a whole bunch of other stuff. I think I heard that Albanese has had some conversations with the US administration around this. What could or what should the Australian government be doing, in your opinion, in regard to Julian Assange from a legal perspective? And is everything that could be being done?
When people are imprisoned Australians are imprisoned overseas, there's two models. Model A is quietly, softly, whispers in corridors, let's get this situation solved, levers being pulled, cards being played. And sometimes that works. We've seen that work, for example, with some people who were recently released from Myanmar or Burma prisons.
Yep.
The other option is go ballistic and really start flying the flag and saying out loud, America, you want to be friends with us, but you're treating one of our citizens like this. And the same with England. This is appalling and we want this fixed.
Yep.
The softly approach has clearly been tried, and probably with goodwill by Turnbull, by Morrison, now by Albanese. And I believe them, and people like Penny Wong, when they genuinely say, behind the scenes, this is what we're doing. We are taking steps, we're doing what we can. I think it's time to change gears and really go to town. This is absolutely appalling treatment of a journalist. Those people who say he's not a journalist, I always say the best people to determine whether someone's a journalist or not a journalist, and they gave him a Wakely Award. So, he's a journalist.
Yeah.
He published embarrassing material.
Yeah.
Talk about freedom of speech. He changed the course of the war and changed the course of many people's lives by his bravery, and he ought to be released. And the Australian government ought to be singing and dancing about it far more loudly because the other steps have not been made. Now, of course, what do I know? Maybe rational heads have made a decision, rightly so, that if we keep doing softly, we're getting there. If we go loud, they'll pull their heels up and say, go away, Australia. After all, we're not a big player. But, more should be done. Why are we entering into agreements like AUKUS while Australian citizens are being treated like this? And it's a real hypocrisy. We all tut-tut when China, we rightly tut-tut when China imposes serious and appalling sentences on people who are in prison for speaking their mind against the regime, and that's wrong. We don't do the same with Julian Assange in England or America, and we should be. We should be getting him out of there and bringing him home. I've spoken publicly at rallies. I've met his father and his brother, and Australian lawyers have been exemplary in speaking out, broadly speaking. And it's bipartisan. Conservative and ALP and Green and even One Nation say that he should be released. So but I think for myself, I suspect the time for quiet diplomacy is over, and let's start flying the flag. Let's start, really banging the drum.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think, this is just my personal opinion for what it's worth, I think leadership's been very soft in Australia. I don't think we've had a real tough, hard leader in this country for a long time. We seem to kowtow to the UK, to the US. It's like this little brother kind of mentality. And I think we need to start stepping up. And I think we need to push back. And I'm not really, an expert in geopolitical, stuff, but, if America wants to use Pine Gap, for instance, maybe we say, well, look, we're going to close Pine Gap unless you bring Julian home, because that's a big part of their five eyes, keeping an eye on everything. And I think we have more power than we give ourselves credit for. And I don't think we push back against these because we say, we're reliant on America for our defence, so therefore we've got to kowtow to them politically to the extent where we sacrifice an Australian citizen without really pushing back. And so I don't know what the answer is. I just think that I'm a big proponent for freedom of speech. Julian Assange is being persecuted for doing his job. If he does get extradited to the US, I hope he makes it to November. And then if Trump as the president and Vivek Ramaswamy as vice president is the ticket that wins, there's a good chance he'll be pardoned and released.
I do not understand why Biden hasn't pardoned him, in the sense that what's it to him? Like, he's not going to lose one vote if he pardoned him. It's crazy.
I don't think Biden's really making any big decisions in the US and probably hasn't for a long time.
Yeah, well, that's right. Perhaps no one's home.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for allowing me to indulge those couple of extra topics I wanted to bring up. It's been absolutely a pleasure to have you here today. I hope this won't be the last time we sit down and have a chat. I've enjoyed it immensely. We seem to agree a lot. I was coming in, I was anticipating maybe we're going to disagree on things, and not that I have a problem with this disagreement. I think it just makes for more compelling viewing. So thank you for sharing and for being an advocate and proponent for drug law reform in Australia, for under the self-harm model, and for all the work that you've done in service to the community. Keep it up, and love to have you back on the show sometime.
Sure, well, thanks. And, it's an indulgence and a pleasurable one to be able to speak not in terms of 10-second grabs or even in terms of refereed journal articles, but to actually speak and converse and work through these things. I mean, it's always valuable for me, and I really appreciate it. And your viewpoints, we do tend to agree on things, but I think that listening to each other and hopefully responses from your audience, we'll all learn from these experiences. I certainly have, so thanks a lot.
Yeah, pleasure, David, and I hope to have you back sometime.
Great. Take care.
Awesome. Thank you.